Hello everybody, my name is Kiran and I'm going to do a little bit of a presentation on reading for pleasure. Hope you find it helpful. So when we think about reading for pleasure, I think it's really important that I start off with a contextual sort of know about what reading for pleasure isn't. It's not a tick list of activities to complete or worksheets where you colour in book characters. It's not an incomplete set of books in a class library, so children might like the Alex Rider series, but you've only got books 1, 3 and 5. Needing to ensure reading comments are logged in a reading diary is not a characteristic of reading for pleasure. Rushing a child to choose a book, telling children what they should be reading based on their attainment is not reading for pleasure. And reading for pleasure is not something that's fluffy. It is a rigorous practice. So it's been written about for quite a long time actually, the benefits of reading for pleasure. A growing number of studies internationally across the world are telling us the same thing when it comes to reading for pleasure. And I think it's really important that I define reading for pleasure as the child having a choice and having their voice heard about what they want to read and what they find interesting. We're talking about volitional reading. It's having the child have ownership of their reading choices alongside everything else that you would need to do in terms of developing skills. But one thing that underpins reading for pleasure is that idea that you cannot have skill without the will first. You need to nurture a love of reading so that the children can, well, thrive when they are reading for learning. Most recently, the reading framework had a little bit more detail about reading for pleasure, and again, a lot of this research is backed by data that is spanning decades. But one of the things that I've developed and will continue to develop with my role at my current place is the idea of book talk, and thinking about it from a dialogic talk point of view, in the sense that when you're enabling a child or children to have a space to create their own meaning through talk, you're going to create readers who are not only engaging with each other but also sharing reading experiences, which then enables them to expand their language, their vocabulary, and it develops their confidence and oracy, which we know is a buzzword as well this year. Children who become engaged in reading can make huge progress in their literacy development simply through their independent reading, whatever the nature of their early reading experiences are. And the point I want to build on, or build on it a little bit later, is it links in with the very recent Book Trust research about intergenerational reading and how families play a huge, actual pivotal role in a child's early reading experiences, because that sets them up for basically enjoying reading for pleasure, which will then have a domino effect on every other aspect of their educational life. Reading for pleasure pedagogy. So everything that I have done and understand about reading for pleasure comes from the Open University's research, which spans decades and informed the 2023 reading framework as well. So the new editions that you see about book talk and about reading for pleasure section 8, it does stem some of it from the Open University research. And this, I think, is a really simple but powerful indicator of what we mean by reading for pleasure. And the point that it's a reading culture. When you're thinking about reading for pleasure, it's got to be something that is woven into everything you do within your school and daily practice. You do need to have that element of independent reading, which links in with volitional reading. Children must have a choice. Reading aloud is essential because not only are you modelling what good reading looks like and modelling fluency and all of those other things that we need for good readers to develop, but it's also that human aspect of sharing a story. And I always link it back to Maslow's hierarchy. It's that safe space that you're sharing with children and helping build reading communities and reading social experiences, which then links in with book talk, inside text talk and recommendations, which I sort of covered in the previous section. But encompassing all of that is that social reading environment. It has to be something that is fluid, it's dynamic, and is representative of the children in your class, in your school. So to develop children's reading for pleasure effectively, there are several things that you would need to consider, and this is based on the first publication that the Open University and Teresa Kremin's team worked on, Building Communities of Engaged Readers, is that we must have a considerable knowledge of children's literature and other texts. If we are wanting to enable a child to find books that they love and want to carry on reading, we must have a good understanding of what's out there so we can make those recommendations for the children based on our relationships and based on us getting to know the children, which links in with the second part of our knowledge of the children as readers. You will have reluctant readers. I don't really call them reluctant readers, it's more children that haven't found the right book yet. But that's where it's so important that within all of this, that your relationship with children is the key to anything, I believe, with reading for pleasure. When you know the children well, you will know what their interests are, and that's where you can direct them and hopefully empower them to make those choices themselves for independent reading. And I think it's a really clear indicator about culture when we're talking about RFP, reading for pleasure pedagogy. These must be characterised, this pedagogy must be characterised by social reading environments, reading aloud, informal book talk, inside text talk recommendations, independent reading time. Teachers who read and readers who teach, that is essential as well, and that's where the phrase was coined, reading teachers. We have to read basically, and we have to have a good knowledge of children's literature, which I would say is just as good as any other literature. Reciprocal and interactive reading communities. It's a level playing field in the sense that we are all equals, and when we're thinking about equity as well, that starts with understanding where your children's starting point are. There will be children in schools where they don't have the bedtime stories, where they don't have lots of books at home to choose from, and you'll have it on the other spectrum where they do have the bedtime stories and they do have lots of books to choose from. You are that bridge and you are that enabler for equity in your classroom because of the inequities that are coming into your classroom. That is a microcosm of society, and we must ensure that what we are doing is to serve all the children, and that means that there will be children that don't have a relationship with reading yet, but that's where this pedagogy is essential to ensure that they do then find their reader identity and their reader voice as well. So it's not what you do, it's why and the way. So, and it's really important that I keep saying culture and pedagogy. It is not a tick list. So what I am talking about here, and I love the acronym that the Open University use, which is LIST. So reading for pleasure pedagogy must be learner-led. It must be informal. So I'm not talking about your discrete reading lessons or looking at skills or looking at the Vipers. That isn't what we're talking about. You need to create space, and there is always space in a timetable to create these informal reading social practices. And this is a must. For it to be learner-led, informal and social, and for it to be impactful, you must have texts that tempt. You must have books in your classroom that your children will want to read. And that doesn't necessarily mean, I've got nothing against awards for books, but it tends to be in the publisher's world that these books get rewarded, not necessarily by teachers. It's really important that the books that you have, some of them might be award-winning books, they might be Carnegie winners, but what is more important is that your children can relate to these books, that the books in your school are there and they are tempting for the children. It might be that you need more comic books, it might be that you need more graphic novels, it might be that you need more poetry editions. It's got to be based on children's interests. For it to be learner-led, informal and social, it has to be based on what your children want to read about, and that's how it becomes a gateway into different types of texts and different reading books. The list is not a checklist. The list is to help us understand how to characterise a reading for pleasure culture. So looking at us in a bit more detail as practitioners that when we widen our knowledge of children's literature and other texts, we become more aware of our own and of the children's reading practices. And I know hand on heart when we do this, children, especially those that are maybe afraid of reading, because you will have children like that because there are certain pressures that comes with phonics and the skill side of it, but they begin to see reading differently when they're enjoying it and feel that they are part of a reading community. They can then more effectively build a reading for pleasure pedagogy and strong community of readers within and around the school. That is what you do as an enabler of equity within your classroom. So the next publication that came out with the phrase reading teachers was Reading Teachers Nurturing Reading for Pleasure Pedagogy. I'll read through the summary of key findings, but again, it's really important that I make the point that this is all based on research there's decades and decades of research that are telling us it enables us to develop their vocabulary, it enables us to develop their sense of identity, their reader identity. Can they see books that represent themselves so they have that feeling of being understood? But it's also in the sense of extending their understanding of what it means to be a reader, in the sense of it's a gateway, it's an opener to everything that they are going to need to do when it comes to subject-specific work, when it comes to understanding vocabulary in, say, science or in geography, in understanding how to comprehend a word problem in maths to then actually do the maths behind it. I think the beautiful thing about Reading for Pleasure more than anything is that it does build a reading community, and every classroom is a microcosm, every school is a microcosm of society, and these children will grow up into the world and need to know that, one, they belong, and two, that they have something to offer the world as well. And when you create a social nature within your reading environment, that impacts the children in terms of their self-efficacy, in terms of their confidence, and in terms of them understanding each other better as human beings as well. It is a bridge to just more than education and attainment. It's a bridge to understanding each other as humans and how to empathise, how to understand, how to support, how to be a better person, and therefore build strong communities. This I absolutely love. Reading for pleasure, a right with consequence. And this was something that was shared in one of the presentations at one of the Open University Reading for Pleasure conferences. And that was my point at the start, that reading for pleasure is not something that is fluffy, it is rigorous. And when done well, and when done as in that it's a culture that is embedded within your school, you are meeting, and I'm going off on a big tangent now, but you're meeting like the UN Convention, Human Rights of a Child, because it's all around education, not just in terms of attainment, but in terms of enabling them to understand what they're good at, what they can move forward with. So it is attainment in literacy and numeracy, vocabulary and general knowledge as well. Making sure that children have a breadth and depth within what they're reading is so important, and it isn't about SATs, but that is something that doesn't seem to be going. It's important that we enable our children to have as much of a reading diet to ensure that their general knowledge is as good as any other person's, so that they can identify things in the world, that they can understand the world better. The reader-to-reader relationships, it is one of the most magical things when you see children that have read the same book and have gasped at the same thing or talking about that part in that book. We are social beings and we are wired for connection. And when you have a reading for pleasure pedagogy and culture within a school or a classroom, I absolutely guarantee your relationships between the children will improve as well. And social emotional well-being. We know that there's a lot of research out from the National Literacy Trust this year about the fact that children within the UK, it's the lowest levels in terms of reading for pleasure and reading engagement. And I think I see that more as an opportunity to see, okay, where has it dipped? We know that there are still elements of COVID, there are still elements of things in terms of social and emotional well-being based around the fact that we have cohorts of children, especially year 3 and 4, who missed out on certain socialisation because of the fact that they were in lockdown. So I think when we're thinking about reading for pleasure, it isn't isolated to just reading and reading lessons. Reading isn't in isolation to anything within the curriculum, and I believe within life as well. It's so important that when they have these books, it goes back to Maslow's hierarchy. It does enable them to feel safe. It does enable them to feel seen. It does enable them to feel like they belong. So the reading teachers, I'm now going to share a little bit of the chapter that I'd written for it, because my chapter was based around children within my classroom at the time, and it was children that were high attaining readers but also naturally loved reading. And then I had one child that naturally, that's where the case study focused on, where he didn't believe he was a reader because he didn't feel that he belonged part of a community because he, in his own words, couldn't read. I think with the chapter that I had written and helped in terms of the case study, this is what was quoted. So her belief in a humanising or relational pedagogy positions her as a teacher who aligns her practice with children's learning experiences and perspectives, honouring their cultures and their worlds. So Declan, obviously that's not the child's name, it's the name in the chapter, did not see himself as a reader because he hasn't experienced anything to basically say that he can read. He was finding phonics difficult. He was finding the fluency, so that bridge between decoding and comprehension, difficult. And the most powerful thing that came out of that once we brought in fluency trees and fluency enablers, and he started to read aloud, which is part of the reading for pleasure pedagogy. So when I talk about reading aloud, it doesn't just have to be the teacher in the room. Story time is a lovely thing, but let's enable the children to feel that they belong and also have ownership of that space. They could be reading aloud. When he started reading aloud in phrases, and most importantly started to hear himself reading phrases, something switched with him, because he started to believe, and it does come down to self-belief and reader identity, that he could read. And so then he was a lot more confident within reading lessons. He'd got the reading book, and by the end of it he felt that he belonged within our reading community. He didn't see himself as other to the more high retaining children. He saw himself as he belonged. And the most lovely thing about it was that within a few weeks he was reading aloud to the whole class, which is something that I am absolutely certain he did not think he was going to do. But it goes back to the idea that reading is humanising, and it enables a child to be, more than anything, a human, and we are humans before learners. And it is so important children understand that they belong. Reading is such an amazing and impactful enabler to help children feel they belong within a community. As part of my love of reading for pleasure, another thing that was then highlighted in 2023 was my work that I shared with the Open University looking at pupil voice and choice. So again, two characteristics of a reading for pleasure culture: the idea that children's voices are valued and that their choices in what they read that's the driving force behind anything we were doing. So it started with book votes, which I'm sure all of you will know of. But it wasn't just the fact that it was a random book vote, it was part and parcel of what we do in terms of making sure that we are listening to our readers and their choices as a class community, as a school community, which then led to favourites on a Friday. So the librarians would go around and they would tally which books were the most popular. And then we created a Battle of the Books thing towards the end of the year, because what was essential that children could see was that their choices is what was driving us to move forward with anything that we were doing around reading. The other powerful thing that we started to do was look at reader recommendations. So that was highlighted through the ideas that we would have books across the school or within the reading library that children could all access, or a group of children could access, so that there were pockets of almost glimmers of them. I'd say, oh my goodness, I've read that book. Have you read that book? And starting to recommend it that way, and then sharing that glimmer with other children, shining a light on those books. Dialogic talk became an enabler as well for us to support children in verbalising their opinions. And that's important as part of a reading lesson as well. I think it's really important that you do open up the floor to ask the children's opinions, because you may be studying a book, but it's so powerful when you ask them of their opinions, because they latch on to that that emotional feeling that they've had, and that leads to deeper learning and deeper understanding and just more engagement. The shiniest glimmer within that piece of work that I submitted was how pupil leaders, our DEI, our diversity, equity and inclusion leaders, again, it was through their pupil voice and choice that they selected books that represented different protected characteristics, and they would go around the school and share those books with their peers through read aloud at the end of the day each week. And then they would come back together and discuss which ones had the most impact. They then chose the ones that the children enjoyed the most, and we had our DEI library and a bookcase where we were highlighting and featuring certain books. But those children, those DEI leaders, drove that. I didn't do anything other than buy the books, and then the rest was up to them in terms of they understood protected characteristics to such a degree that they could choose books that represented those protected characteristics, but also owning how they would share that story and share that learning with their peers from early years all the way up to year 6. That was a proud moment when those children were highlighted and celebrated. And I hope the point that's coming across with the practice is that it comes from embedding a culture of we are going to listen to children's voices, and the books that we are bringing into our school community are based on what they want to read. You will always have your spine of books that will come into English, onto literacy, but it's so important that children's voices are heard in some way when it comes to reading for pleasure. Because if we're determined to get children to choose and to read independently, that volition can only come from giving them agency and choice. So finally, these are just a few more examples of reading for pleasure in terms of embedding a culture. One thing at my school at the moment, Oasis Academy Woodview, is learning about the different heritages and cultures within the school community. We have 42 languages that are spoken within our school community, which is amazing. And so we are driving a storybook initiative where the children write their own stories, but then read aloud in English, but also in their home language. And we've started to record the children do that so that they can understand each other better, learn about each other's cultures better as well. But the most powerful thing with the display that you can see above the story is that children can see that they are valued, they belong, and that they are represented. So all 42 languages, which means all of our children within our school community, are represented in a really special and very unique way to us. The stories that have been written by the children are fantastic, but the magic comes when they listen to each other. So getting them to record their stories in English and in their home language is such an enabler, and has developed and is developing, I can't say developed yet, is developing our reading for pleasure, pedagogy and culture in a unique way to the children that we have in our school. The other thing that we are developing is empathy reads, which links in with Empathy Lab and the work that they do. So Empathy Action Month, November, is coming up as well. So shout out to Empathy Lab there. And again, this is driven by pupil leaders. So each half term we have a theme that links in with protected characteristics, which links in with British values, because as I said before, reading is a humanising practice, and it is essential that as part of our reading for pleasure pedagogy, we are enabling children to understand each other as humans, and understand humans that they might not necessarily meet, but should still have an understanding of, because essentially stories are lived experiences, and that's the beauty of walking into a lived experience of somebody and sharing and understanding it in some way. So this half term we looked at race, which linked in with Black History Month. Next half term we're going to look at religion, because it will link in with lots of festivals. Spring one we're looking at displacement and refugees and what it means to be displaced. Spring two we'll be looking at gender equity, looking at girls and women. Then we will look at disability, and then finally we will look at men and boys and link it in with mental health. We also have Britannica magazine as part of our reading for pleasure culture, in the sense of developing vocabulary and enabling the children to, you know, read stories and text in a different way. And magazines is something that they absolutely love in our higher key stages. Author visits. But again, our author that we have, Richard O'Neill, has become an author in residence, which means that we are developing a relationship with him that will enable our children to progress with, you know, what we do with our author. And it's based around dual heritage, dual coded books, looking at vocabulary and language, but again, specific to our children and listening to their views and their opinions. And finally, the last thing that we're doing is using the book trust research, looking at how to support intergenerational reading and closing that reading gap. So we're developing Bambinos and books, where we're inviting families who have toddlers or children that will be starting reception in summer again. So we started it last summer, for them to come in and literally just sit and read with their children and just peruse books if they want to. But it's that social reading environment that we are saying to parents is what we value most of all when it comes to reading and reading for pleasure. The skill will come, but it is essential we get the will first, because if we don't nurture that love of reading based on understanding the children and their interests and what they like to read and like to learn about, the skill won't get to where it could get to. So that's reading for pleasure, sort of in a nutshell. I hope it was helpful. And if you have any other questions or would like any more information, please look at the Research Rich Pedagogy's website, which is around all the Open University work. Empathy Lab, which you can find on Twitter, but they also have a website. Book Trust has lots of research on reading for pleasure, intergenerational reading, closing the gap. Britannica magazine, Richard O'Neill does brilliant work as well. And there was one more that I'm sure you'll remember as you watch this that I did say as well. I hope that was helpful, and thank you for having me today.